Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the God Questions podcast. I'm Rachel Short and this is Mark Lucinius.
What's up?
And we are a part of a church planning team in the Westchester area called Project 938. And we're in the midst of a series right now that we're calling the God Questions. And throughout this series, we're talking about different questions that each one of us have about faith. Whether it's science and faith, is science still relevant? Whether it's suffering in the world, why do bad things happen to good people? Is the Bible still reliable? Can we believe that? How do we know that it is true? Mm-hmm. And last week on Mother's Day, May 12th, Mark talked about why is Christianity so restrictive? Do you want to share a little bit about that, Mark?
Yeah, we talked about a lot of the experiences that people have had of the faith, and a lot of times people feel like it's restrictive, or like the faith that they had as a child, it just doesn't really work for them as an adult. And what we talked about was this concept you see in Scripture of a life that is truly life, with the caveat that there actually may be a life that's not truly life. And so we talked about that, and if you want to hear more, check it out on the podcast.
Check it out on the podcast. Awesome. So over the course of this series, we've been getting text messages in. People have been sending emails and asking us their questions that they have about faith. And on this episode of the podcast, we are addressing questions about the Old Testament and the New Testament. And here's a couple of those questions. To start off is, what are some of the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament? You and I are going to be kind of addressing some of these questions together.
Sure, so why don't we let you start out?
Okay, I'll start out. All right, so some of the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So a first difference that we can note are the fact that they were written in two different languages. So the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in Greek. And this also connects with the fact that there are different cultural differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. The Old Testament was in the midst of forming the nation of Israel. The New Testament was focusing on the movement of Christianity. So you look in the book of Acts, there is very, very much an evangelistic movement. And so as we are able to kind of talk through some of these differences in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's so important to be able to look culturally about what's going on.
Yeah, and you'll see different kinds of genres. And so in the Old Testament, you'll see songs, you'll see proverbs, like little, cute one-liners that are really quite wise. Some of these statements of wisdom can feel contradictory, and sometimes wisdom is, but it creates these tensions in the conversations. There's love songs, there's prophecies, and that's the variety you see in the Old Testament. And the New Testament, you'll see some of the history, stories of the life of Jesus, stories of the early church, but then you have some practical ways of living when it comes to the apostles teaching the churches how to live out the life for the church. One of the things, as you were talking, I was thinking, some people may wonder, well, like, if it was in Hebrew and Greek, what are we looking at now? Mm-hmm. And one of the misconceptions people have of the Bible is that it's kind of been like rewritten over time after time after time after time. Well, I have a Bible here, and if I'm opening up into sort of the book of Proverbs here, or the book of Psalms, what we know is that the English that you have here was translated from the best manuscripts we have of the Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew, and so these are texts that are thousands of years old. And what you have in the New Testament is a direct translation from the best Greek manuscripts to modern day English. And so there's a lot of different translations, but each of these translations aren't like just a better version of English. They're fresh expressions of that original language.
Yeah, no, that's great. So kind of talking through a little bit more specifically, another question that I know that I get pretty regularly, you probably get it as well, Mark, is the Old Testament still relevant today? So some would say because Jesus, preached the good news of the gospel in the New Testament, then why do we even need the Old Testament? Why is the Old Testament as important? And so I like to think of this as an example of, okay, when we're thinking about how a person is revealing themselves to us, so how I can come to know you, if I were to just, look up certain videos of Mark Lucinius when he was 10 years old and just watch those videos, over and over again, maybe when you were 10.
That'd be so disappointing.
Maybe when you're 13. We should do that sometime. That'd be fun.
Gosh.
When you're 10, you're 13 or whatever. And then I tried to tell you what I thought, who I thought that you were. That would be, you would be like, no, that's not who I am. That's not who I am today. And so I think that it's really easy sometimes to think that, okay, well, in order to understand what Christianity is, I'm just going to open up the Bible and pick any chapter, like the chapter of Leviticus, and just read through some of those chapters and then think that I know a lot about what Christianity is. But ultimately, how God chooses to reveal himself is ultimately up to him. And so I think just looking at this question of, okay, the Old Testament, is it still relevant today? Well, those videos of you when you're 10 years old, those are still relevant in terms of who you are, but it's not the full picture of who you are ultimately. And so I need to be able to understand who Mark is by how you not only tell me about yourself, but also spending time with you too. And so the way that God revealed himself to us was historical, and that his aim for revealing himself ultimately in the culmination, the person of Jesus in the New Testament is that culmination of who he ultimately is. But Jesus was also there in the Old Testament as well. And so understanding just the nature of who God is, I think is a perfect starting point in terms of looking at this idea of, okay, how does God reveal himself to us? And so in order to be able to see how God reveals himself to us, we have to understand who God is in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament.
Sure. And to clarify, there's not actually like a Jesus-like person in the Old Testament.
Right.
But the way we understand who God is if God's three in one, God is the same God is revealing himself in the Old Testament, as who revealed himself fully in the New Testament. Can I push your metaphor just a little bit farther? Let's just say I'm a 25-year-old single person, and I want to get out there on like a dating site. I have a lot of good reasons to not put a video of my 13-year-old self on that dating site, right? Though it would be a true part of who I am, it's not necessarily going to help people understand who I am. The way a relationship is built is you deal with a person who they are now, and then over time, you get tested out at Thanksgiving with the parents, and you see if they can survive the crazy uncle who asks you the weird questions and stuff like that. You make sure that the person you're dating isn't the crazy uncle. Anyway, but eventually those things go, and eventually, like when it gets to a certain point, that's when the videos of the 13-year-old come out. And so when it comes to the Old Testament, the relevance of the Old Testament is that the goal of the Bible is to know God, and if you want to know God, you need to know their story. If somebody is going to know me, well, they're going to get to know me a little bit, in just regular interactions. But if you really want to have an understanding of who I am, as I tell stories of who I was 8, 10, 12, 15, as you meet my family members and as you meet my friends from different phases of life, a fuller picture comes into play. And so anybody who wants to know God, have a relationship with God, seeing how he interacted with people throughout history gives you a sense of understanding of how he will interact with me.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's awesome. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the distinction between the Yahweh of the Old Testament and the Jesus in the New Testament in our next podcast as well, in terms of the Old Testament.
Sure, particularly people have like, does God want me to go commit a genocide like he did in the Old Testament?
Right.
That's not
Yeah.
actually there. But anyway, but some people have that idea,
Have that
and we'll
idea.
go after that in the next
Yeah.
one.
Perfect.
Well, we have one more question,
we
right?
do. Yes, yeah. So why does the Old Testament, Yahweh, seem different than the New Testament, Jesus?
Sure. And so some of you, when you hear the word Yahweh, you're like, who's that? Like, that's just that's a simple translation of the Lord, but it was sort of his personal name. And so why does it sometimes feel different? And I'll probably jump out and say that in some ways that's a myth, because I think what'll happen sometimes is that people will get snapshots of certain parts of the Bible, and they'll kind of assume that that's how it totally is. For example, one of the classic understandings is that the Old Testament God is very judgmental, and Jesus kind of like hippie, all about love, and that actually they're not as different as you might seem. As you read through the life of Jesus, you'll see Jesus use very strong condemning language, particularly towards religious leaders. And what you'll actually find in the Old Testament is that almost every time God is using strong, harsh, challenging, and even judgmental language, he's using it towards those who are in power. In a very similar way that Jesus did. And conversely, what you'll find in the Old Testament is that Yahweh is particularly concerned for the poor, for the marginalized, for those who are outside of power, for the immigrants, for the widows, the orphans, just like Jesus. And it's almost like Jesus was God incarnate, because there's a pretty seamless picture of who they are. Though there's a couple of themes that show up differently, but at one level there's a myth there. I have one more thought on that, but I don't want to jump ahead of you too far.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I think we're going to address more of those questions in our second podcast of the Old Testament as well. And so we'll do that in next week's podcast, in our 4th episode of the podcast. So we hope that you will join us then. And we hope to see you on a Sunday morning as well at 9 a.m. and 10:30 at Fugate Middle School. If you're in the Westchester or the Philly area, definitely drop by on Sunday. We'll have a few more weeks of the God Question series, and we would love to see you there.
Yeah, we'll see you in part 2 next week.
Part 2.
See you.